Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at my top reads from the first quarter of the year. This is going to be separate from my top new fantasy releases, so if that's something you're interested in, if it's already up, I'll have it linked, but if not, be on the lookout as it'll be up very soon. For today though, we're going to be looking at some backlist fantasy works that I thought were standouts, as well as a couple of books I picked up from other genres. If you are somebody that more so cares about the fantasy books though, I am going to group those together and they're going to be discussed in the latter half, so that way you are welcome to just skip straight ahead to those, and I'll have timestamps so that you know exactly when to skip ahead to. But if you're somebody who reads really broadly, or you just like hearing about books from other genres in general, then that is what we're going to start with. Kicking it off, we have The Stationery Shop. This was actually a recommendation from one of you, and a huge thank you. I'm pretty sure I say thank you every time I bring it up, but a huge thank you again for the recommendation, as I obviously thought it was absolutely fantastic. This is a historical fiction story that is going back and forth between various points in time. Initially, it kicks off with the woman who is elderly, about to be reunited with somebody from her past, and then we actually go to the past, and then we fluctuate between these 2 points in time, as well as a variety of things in between. When you go to the past though, and this makes up a bulk of the story for quite a while, you're looking at 1950s Tehran, and you're seeing this initially as what feels like a backdrop to the story, but then everything that's going on and everything that feels like it's very much in the background ends up playing a huge role in what pulls these two people apart. Additionally, you are looking at a lot to do with familial drama. The dynamics between all of the different people in the story are really heartbreaking. There's so much potential and you just feel like there's so much hope, and then how everything kind of comes crashing down and crumbling is really heartbreaking. I think that the book explored mental health, generational trauma, and the immigrant experience exceptionally. It is a deeply tragic and heartbreaking story, but there's also a lot to it that just shows what it is to live life, all the ups and downs and the tragedies in between. I thought it was incredibly moving. It also, I thought, utilized the split timeline really well. I actually don't tend to like stories that explore such a large portion of time, as I find that as a character-driven reader, I prefer to feel a little bit closer to the character. And when you take a step back and you start to almost montage their life, I feel almost disconnected to them. But I didn't feel that was a situation whatsoever. I felt that the writer had a way of delivering what was transpiring in the story where you really felt like you were, not to put it in a way that's diminishing, but it's like you got the bullet points, the important moments, and you understood how they all connected. It was woven together really fantastically, and there was integrations of other perspectives throughout the story, which I wasn't expecting when I picked it up. But you do randomly, between parts, you get other people's perspectives, and at first you're kind of thinking, okay, I guess this sort of helps expand our view of everything that's happening, but then you start to realize how much of a key factor those people's lives play in the main two characters' lives. At first, though, in ways that you can't really imagine, but then as everything unfolds, it becomes much clearer to you. And I think this is where the familial aspects and the generational trauma are really, really well shown. In general, I thought this was absolutely fantastic. I would recommend this to essentially everyone. I thought it was amazing, very moving, really liked the writing style. I thought it was fantastic. Highly, highly recommend. Exceptionally different from The Stationery Shop, we have Just for the Summer. I feel like this probably feels as though it's coming out of left field, and it is to some degree, as this is a little outside of the norm for me. And where The Stationery Shop was, as I stated multiple times, a tragedy in a lot of ways, this is a contemporary romance story, so it's understood when you pick it up that there's going to be some form of a happily ever after. And I was trying to read at least somewhat broadly within the first quarter, as I did pick up a fair amount of fantasy, of course, as I'm wont to do. And the fantasy itself also had a decent amount of variety within it, so I wanted to have a similar experience with the stories I was picking up outside of fantasy. And I'm so glad I did, because I really feel like this captures why you can have a story that is presented as happy and that you know there are going to be positive elements to it, and it still contains very, very deeply moving and things that I think people can connect with. It contains all of that. So the setup for the story is kind of, your silly meet cute rom-com type of how are they going to meet, and it's kind of filled with shenanigans. You have this young woman who is a traveling nurse, her and her best friend, who is also somewhat like her sister in a lot of ways. They travel from place to place, and she ends up sort of online meeting this guy, and they meet through this shared situation, if you want to call it that, this phenomenon where they both find that every single time they date somebody, when it doesn't work out between them, the very next person that their ex dates, they end up marrying. So they jokingly say it's a curse that they're the person that somebody dates before they find their forever person. And she ends up seeing this person have a post online about the situation. So she DMs them and says, oh, hey, the exact same thing always happens to me. And as a joke, he says, maybe we should date, because then if we do, then whoever we meet next will end up being our forever person. And so it starts kind of as a joke, but then they get to talking and they start to have chemistry and they like each other and they're like, well, what the heck? Let's just do it. Let's just go for it. It'll probably be fun and ridiculous. And it's just, at this point, two friends who are kind of just going on dates, and then that'll be that. We'll go our separate ways and it'll be fine. So I recognize that the setup for the story is really silly and absolutely ridiculous. That said, I was really taken aback with just how well I felt that the author captured something that turns out to be a pattern of behavior that is very much rooted in having a mother who neglects her child. And it's, of course, something you can extrapolate and apply to a lot of different kinds of relationships. In this particular story, it was really exploring between the mother and the daughter how much the mother's actions have impacted her daughter. And I do feel like sometimes with contemporary romance that I've picked up, I feel sometimes I'm really impressed by whatever the kind of other thing is that's going on in the background. I feel like a good example is The 7-Year Slip, which explores the death of a loved one. And in that story, while that was explored really well, I felt like there was a love story and it was cute, but it was fine. I didn't really feel that compelled by the love story in that one. But in this one, I thought that the chemistry between the characters was very well executed. And that is not the easiest thing to accomplish. Reading a lot of fantasy books, trying to dip my toes in fantasy romance books, and then also just going for contemporary romance, I actually feel like there is something to writing chemistry between characters, and it's difficult. And sometimes we fall back on these tropes, and that's something so many of us complain about, is it's the fact that it's like, okay, well, I guess we'll just throw in the one bed, forced proximity, fake dating, enemies to lovers, and that's chemistry, I guess. And you're like, oh no, it's about the dialogue and the way they bounce off of each other and the way that they uplift each other and challenge each other. And there's ways to write it that actually feels compelling and feels like real exchanges between people, so that you understand the attraction and why they're going to care about each other, which I thought all of that was done very, very well. And the other part of it was done exceptionally well, the part that has to do with the mother and how she impacts her daughter. So the daughter grew up in foster care because of the mother's neglect, and she's always summed it up to, there's just something about my mom that makes her feel unsteady. I don't really know what exactly is going on with her, but I choose to be empathetic and understanding. She had a really difficult childhood. She had me really young, and I just think she's kind of been alone in the world, trying her best. I know she loves me, and that's kind of her view of her mother. And every time her mother comes back in her life, she tries so hard because she truly does crave that love from her mother. And then you're seeing throughout the story how the mother's tendencies to essentially abandon the daughter lead for her to try and abandon everybody else in her own life, which of course plays a role in her relationship that is developing, but not just her relationship with this person. It affects her entire life. And so you're really seeing the way that you often, what you want from a certain situation and what you want to avoid from, you don't want to take on the wrong lessons from this person in trying so hard to avoid the hurt feelings that you've had in the past. You end up causing those hurt feelings in someone else, or in a lot of ways, you end up causing hurt feelings to yourself over and over again. And it's this vicious cycle. And it was, like I said, it was captured so incredibly well. And I was so surprised, not because I want to be clear, not because I don't think that contemporary romance can do those things, but that's just not the thing I tend to find most of us pick up contemporary romance for. You expect when you have these cutesy covers and you hear about this like silly love story, you're thinking like, oh, this is going to just be so fun and it's going to be a good time, which I'm not trying to imply it was mismarketed either. It was just, it did all the fun, silly shenanigans really well. It did the character development and the relationship building really well. And then I just feel like all of a sudden there was this heartbreaking development of familial aspects to the story that I was just really impressed by. I thought was really fantastic. Very moving. It was difficult to read in certain instances. I think if somebody has a relationship that even somewhat resembles that, then that actually might be difficult for them to pick up, but really thought it was done very, very well. I was really, as I said a number of times, I was quite impressed, and I look forward to reading more works by this author. Now, shifting to fantasy, the first one for today would be To Shape a Dragon's Breath. I did recently do a full in-depth non-spoiler review for this, so you might have already seen me talk about it, but this was amazing. This is a first book in a series, and if it continues to be as good as this first book was, even if it doesn't deliver quite as much as this first book did, but it's still good, I absolutely think this is going to be a new favorite series of all time for me, because that's just how good I thought the first book was, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the author does in future installments. Not sure currently if it's going to be a duology, a trilogy, or something longer, but point is, this first book was amazing. The setup for the story is that you follow this young woman named Anakus, and she lives with her family, and she, at the beginning of the story, sees a dragon, and she ends up finding its egg. Her and her family all come together, and her sense of community, they all kind of come together to care for the dragon egg and to look after it, and once it hatches, it essentially imprints on Anakus, and so she now has recognized that she has this responsibility to look after this dragon. But she is informed that due to the people who have conquered them and sort of forced them to try and assimilate into their way of life, that she is not allowed to care for this dragon outside of their jurisdiction. If she's going to keep the dragon, she must then go to this one school to be educated not just on how to deal with a dragon, but be educated in what they deem valuable and important for society. If she refuses, the dragon at the very least will be taken away from her, or they might even kill the dragon. Even though Anakus is trying to do everything she can to care for this dragon and do everything as the law says she has to, there are still a lot of people that, just by the very nature of who she is and where she comes from, they don't feel like she should be able to care for this dragon. So there's already so much to just the opening of the story and the intricacies with how she is meant to fit within society and the ways that she's trying so hard to hold to what she cares about, to hold to her traditions and her values, while also recognizing that she lives in a society that doesn't appreciate different groups of people or different things that other people have to offer. But once she arrives at this school, you do have what is essentially a school setting, which is something I don't know that we see as often nowadays unless it's a dark academia story, but sort of your classic school setting I actually kind of miss. I guess in a way this book made me realize how much I miss a great school setting, and I do feel like the school setting was done very well. This is also an opportunity for other characters to be introduced, including somebody that she rooms with and other people at this school who come from different backgrounds, some of which are essentially the elite within society, and then other people are just from various different backgrounds that are a collection of different experiences, and how the author captures every single one of those is fantastic. You also get glimpses of the lives of the adult characters, and just seeing all the different ways that everybody comes together, I just thought it was exquisite. In my review for this, I compared it to Blood Over Brighthaven and said it's essentially like if you had that story, but with a more likable main character and you added dragons, which I still stand by. I read these fairly close together and I thought they were both standouts. And then I would also say if you're somebody who hasn't picked up Blood Over Brighthaven, so that comparison doesn't really mean anything to you, but you have read Babel, for me, this took a lot of what I liked about Babel and then it expanded on it and maybe went even more in depth. I thought it was just so good. I thought it was so good. It did so many things incredibly well. And I feel I haven't even gotten into the magic system is fantastic. The dragons and the different kinds of dragons and their bonds with the characters I really, really enjoyed. It just has so many things that I thought were amazing. The last book for today is more so of an honorable mention. It's not quite on the same level as something like To Shape a Dragon's Breath, where I feel like I'm not going to shut up about that one for the rest of time for as long as I talk about books. But I still thought it was fantastic and worth discussing, and that would be A River Enchanted. As the title would imply, this book was very enchanting, from the world building to the magic to the setting. There were just so many pieces of this that had this romantic feeling to it, but also had a darkness that I felt was somewhat reminiscent of more of a dark fairy tale or this sinister folklore, but there is a lot of beauty to the story as well, which I think is perfectly captured by, while there is a range of characters and perspectives, I would say this is captured by the first person you're introduced to, as he is somebody who is returning from the mainland, where he has his whole life ahead of him. He has lived a lot of his life here. He has students that he teaches. He has an expertise when it comes to music, and he's likely going to be a professor in this, but then he is called back to his island. He figures, I'm just going to stay there for a little bit, and then I'll come back, but he's really sucked in and pulled in by the allure of his home, that's what I meant by, I feel like all of what I was describing is captured by that, him going back and then just being pulled in by everything. And the story actually goes between him and a number of other characters. He is on the younger side, and there is another character that he interacts with that is somebody he grew up with. So there is somewhat of a childhood, there are memories between these characters, and there's sort of a challenging of who they were to each other then and who they are to each other now. But you also have characters that are somewhat protectors of the island or healers, and they're parents, and it's so rare to see characters who have children in the story, but you are pretty much filled with fear right away when you find out that part of why our character has been called back is that there are a lot of children that are going missing, so it makes you fear for the daughter of the other characters, as you don't want them to lose their child, and you also don't know what'll happen if they do, because given that one of them is a protector of the island, there are enemies on the island. You fear what the repercussions would be, not just for the safety of the young child and the family, but also for the safety of anybody that gets in the way. It is a mystery, though, as to what is transpiring and what is actually causing these disappearances. And this is where his musical expertise comes into play, as there are these spirits on the island, and there is this uncertainty as to whether it is human beings that people are enemies with, or if it's the spirits that are actually taking the children, and they wonder if through music and the connection that music has to this sense of worship and magic with these spirits, if that's going to at least allow for them to communicate with them and find out what they can and sort of piece together this mystery. I described this as feeling like it's not just fantasy, but there's also elements of noir in a sense because of the general mystery that you get throughout the story, but also there's like a grittiness to just kind of the reflecting on the victims of these sorts of crimes. And so it was not an element to the story I was expecting, but I really, really deeply enjoyed it. And the writing in general, I thought was very, very lush, but not necessarily purple. It's very atmospheric, but also it's not so atmospheric that you don't feel like you're there alongside the characters. There's just a really wonderful balance that is struck throughout the story in so many different ways. I'm really, really glad I picked this one up. I can't wait to read its sequel. That's it for some of my top books that I picked up within the first quarter. As stated before, I will be also discussing my top new fantasy releases, as there were some standouts with that as well. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.